living fully alive in every way. You're listening to Relationship Prescriptions with Dr. Carol.
Hello again, friends, and welcome to Relationship Prescriptions. I'm Dr. Carol, and so glad that you've joined us. Are there times when you wake up more tired than when you went to bed, feeling like no matter how much you try and sleep, you are still overwhelmed, overstressed, drained, and tired? Well, you are not alone if that's the case. I know there are times in my life when my fatigue has nothing to do with sleep. We could spend a whole episode talking about sleep itself. But today, I'm talking with my friend, Dr. Sandra Dalton-Smith, about rest in a much broader perspective than sleep. Dr. Sandra Dalton-Smith is a busy physician, author, and mom. She has written a book, Sacredness: Recover Your Life, Renew Your Energy, and Restore Your Sanity. Dr. Dalton-Smith is an internal medicine physician, an author, and speaks in various capacities around the country, in large measure about this whole idea of finding relief from the overwhelm and stress that so many of us are experiencing. I have just, as I'm recording this and preparing this podcast episode, I have just returned from an unexpected week of travel in some very stressful circumstances, some challenging mental and emotional environments and decisions and activities that were out of the norm for me. And I am feeling the need of some rest and restoration. And this conversation with Dr. Sandra Dalton-Smith was really insightful for me in unpacking what are some of the things that make us overwhelmed, overstressed, and fatigued, and what it looks like to find some rest and restoration. So here is my conversation with Dr. Sandra Dalton-Smith. Well, Dr. Sandra Dalton-Smith, thank you so much for joining us on the program today. It is such a pleasure.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
This whole area of overwhelm and rest and energy and health, you and I as physicians, I know we've experienced this personally and with our patients. But before we get into some of the details of this super important topic and how insightfully you've written about it, let me just ask you at first to speak about how this topic became important to you. How did you get to working on, thinking about, diving into the research on this whole area of rest?
Really, it started with my own burnout experience. I got to that point just within my professional life where things were starting to get where I just couldn't continue on in that capacity. I could no longer continue with the amount of energy I was expelling in so many different areas without just coming to the end of myself. And so I knew that I had to have something to start restoring my life, and I knew sleep alone wasn't fixing it because that was what I thought, but it just wasn't working.
You and I have probably both experienced this in our medical training. I remember, at least for me, there would be times when I felt like I got very, very little sleep, but there was just so much else to keep going. And you felt like if you could only get a good night's sleep, everything would be okay. And sometimes it was. But with other demands in life, I've experienced the same thing, that sleep isn't always the answer. There's more to rest than sleep. In your book, Sacred Rest, you talk about that distinction and unpack that a little bit, if you would.
Sleep to me really is just focusing on the physical part of rest. Sleep does affect all of our body, our entire bodies, but as far as when I look at rest, when we think about it as being sleep, it's really the physical part of rest that we're benefiting from. The parts of rest that we don't often think about, things like the emotional, the social, the sensory, the creative, all the other aspects of rest that there are, those aren't as affected by sleep. So you can't get rest, you can't be inspired, you can't have your kind of your ability to build relationships and have healthy relationships restored while you're sleeping. And for many of us, there are places within our lives that we are being drained that when you just go to sleep, you're not going to actually start restoring those specific areas. And unless you start restoring those specific areas, you don't get the benefit that you're looking for.
What I hear in your description is that this is as much about emptiness as it is fatigue. And if we're empty in other areas of our lives, we're going to feel tired and fatigued and overwhelmed.
That's exactly right. And so when I started trying to look at my own life, how am I going to get the energy back that I feel like I'm missing? Because every day we're pouring out in different areas, different energy buckets. And so for me, I was pouring out, you're sitting down with patients, there's an emotional, there's a social, there's a lot of components that go along with that. There's a mental in that, you're diagnosing. So there's a lot that you're giving out in that interaction. And so when I would come home at the end of the day, it really didn't dawn on me initially that I needed to have somebody pour back into me in those areas, that I couldn't continue day in and day out pouring out of those buckets and never thinking about ever receiving in those areas.
You referenced your own burnout a minute ago. As much as you're able to, what was that like for you, and what were some of the things that you had to change to get out of that area?
Well, for me, it looked like just not enjoying life anymore. So work became this thing that I did. It was just expected of me. I would get up, do what I had to do, come home. I was really short-tempered. My body ached all the time. I had chronic neck and back fatigue and tension, and just this feeling that my body wasn't well. I found myself actually getting sick more often than I had ever before. My immune system was pretty much non-existent because of the level of stress that I was holding on to. My relationships were strained, relationships with family as well as with patients and staff, because when you're stressed, it's very hard to be patient. So my temper was very on edge. There were just so many components. And I believe that's really what made me start looking at rest, not as this one-sided thing that we often think about it as, I'll just rest on the weekend, which for many of us means you're going to just cease activity and lay around. But that is this multifaceted thing that requires us to be very intentional in how we go about addressing getting more of it.
I think this applies to me even right now as we're recording this. Just today, I have returned from a weeks-long unexpected out-of-town trip that involved, some travel, and my body needs some physical rest. But it was one of the most emotionally and mentally straining weeks that I have experienced in quite some time. And so as I hear you talk about these different areas of rest, my whole being just says, oh, please, I need that. Maybe you can just unpack what those 7 types of rest that you talk about in the book, Sacred Rest. Just mention what those 7 different types are.
Yes, I'll name them first, and then we can kind of go through a little bit of each of them. The 7 are physical, mental, and spiritual. Those are the 3 most of us are familiar with. And then the 4 that are less commonly known are the emotional, social, sensory, and creative. And so the physical is just that. It's the body aches, the pain, all of those are symptoms when someone has a physical rest deficit. Their body's tight and tense and wound up. And so the physical rest are those things we do to undo that damage. So it could be massage, it could be walking, something that really just improves the circulation and the lymphatics. And I know sometimes people think walking is rest if you're intentionally needing physical rest, because what you're needing is your body to have the ability to start healing itself. And so if you're sitting at a job, at a desk all day, then yes, walking can be part of that restoration, because you're restoring the circulation and the lymphatics that are needed to the body to be able to start repairing and healing itself.
So, yes, I have also in my medical area of OBGYN talked with many women with certain, hormonal challenges or, excuse me, or seasons of life that are stressful, and a daily walk, some physical activity can reap so many benefits in well-being beyond just the measurable things in their body, but impacts their mind, their emotions as well.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things people have a difficult time with when they think about rest. They automatically think about cessation of activity. And the mindset shift that has to occur is that rest should equal restoration. So the area of rest, whether it's physical, mental, any of the 7 we just named, the goal is to restore what has gotten out of balance, what has been drained, what has been used to the point that it is no longer working at its healthiest capacity.
That ought to be tweeted. Rest equals restoration. That's one to remember, folks. I love that. I love that. Well, beyond the physical, mention what rest and restoration can look like in some of these other areas.
Well, a big one for a lot of people is a mental rest deficit. And those people, one of the ways to tell if that might be an area that you're dealing with is if you're in your 30s or 40s and all of a sudden you feel like, or 50s even, and all of a sudden you feel like you have dementia, and no one in your family has early dementia, but you're thinking you do because you have a hard time concentrating. You're not learning things as quickly as you did in the past. All of a sudden, when you lay down to sleep at night, you can't turn your brain off. You're ruminating over information or thinking about your to-do list for the next day or going over conversations. All of these are things that your mental capacity is being strained and stressed, is being overloaded. And that inability to concentrate is because there's too many things going on and your attention isn't narrowed down to actually be able to retain information well. So mental rest for many is learning how to clear out that cerebral kind of hum or that cerebral chatter that's constantly going on in the head. Just one very simple, practical thing that can be done if you're someone who has the kind of nighttime mental list you run through is to allow the brain the ability to release information by putting it in a concrete location, like on a notepad or on a Post-it note or even in a journal, but writing down whatever those thoughts are that you're trying to hold on to remember to do tomorrow, rather than trying to hold on to them mentally. Put them on a piece of paper or on a journal so that you can allow your mind to let it go.
Makes a lot of sense. So your brain isn't having to do that work when you're ready to end for the day. You mentioned spiritual rest, Sandra, and I know that you and I, as Christian believers, believe that God has a lot to say about this, and that the Bible has a lot to say about this. As we, in just mentioning that the spiritual kind of rest, how do you see that integrating one's spiritual life and faith and rest there, integrating with this whole idea of restoration?
Well, the thing with spiritual rest for me is really getting an understanding that service for God is not the same thing as intimacy with God. And so sometimes, particularly, I find that pastors have a difficulty with spiritual rest sometimes because they are busy in the Word and they are busy doing work for God. And sometimes that whole relationship component gets placed on a lower realm to the work that's being done. And so to stay in a level of being able to really stay full spiritually is that ability to remain in His presence and to be aware of where you are at in that part of your life.
The idea of not just doing but being, that God made us as human beings, not human doings, and that's what really has to be priority.
Yes, and really the interesting thing is the very first time rest is mentioned in the Bible, is in Genesis, just in the creation story. And even with that, it just set a really beautiful precedence on what it should look like. Man was created on the sixth day, and on the seventh day was the day that God rested. And I always have, really read that and just kind of washed over the thought, okay, God rested. But when I was working on the book, one thing that really stood out to me is, what was man doing while God was resting?
Yeah, right.
He was resting as well,
Yes.
because it doesn't even talk about man doing the work until the second chapter, after the whole creation story has concluded. That's when we actually start hearing about man working. Because on the sixth day, God just kind of gave the commissioning, as far as be fruitful, multiply, have dominion. All of that was telling what it's going to look like. But before the work was ever really done, man was taken into a season of rest. I've always thought I had to work to earn my rest, when really the biblical example is that I should be working from a place of rest.
Wow, that's powerful. That's powerful. Some of the other less commonly talked about, you talked about creative and emotional and social and so on. Let's talk about those. Go ahead and unpack that a bit.
Well, emotional and social, because they deal with people and our relationship with people, I often discuss them together. They are different. They are different in that the emotional is kind of how you relate to people. So it's the ability to be authentic and to take the mask off, to not feel like you're having to perform. And this is really hard for people who are professionals, because part of the professionalism is a type of performance.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though you're not trying to be inauthentic, you are having to perform just in that whole trying to stay professional. You're not allowing yourself to just be who you are. You're trying to stay within what is considered to be the norm. And so it's important to understand that that's not a bad thing to want to be professional, but you shouldn't always have that mask on 24 hours a day, because it's exhausting. There should be people that you can, so to speak, let your hair down with and just be who you are authentically, without feeling like you're having to hide something or to keep something hidden away from them. The social part of rest is how we feel when we are around others. And so there are those people that we don't even sometimes understand why, but whenever we're around them, we feel more drained. They're kind of tiring to us for some reason. They zap the energy from us. And then there are those people who we are around who are more life-giving. Mm-hmm. They tend to have kind of more of a positive energy that makes you feel better. And so it's important to recognize how people affect you, and to make a priority of spending some time with people who are your life givers. Because the people who are more draining are more likely to be the ones who you have to spend the most time with. Those are the ones that are needing things from you. That's why you feel that. So the draining people aren't bad people. Your kids can be draining because that is the nature of that relationship. They're needing things from you. If you have young kids at home, they need to be fed. They need clothes. They need laundry done. All of those are things that are needed from you. So that relationship, you're going to feel that pull just because of the nature of the relationship. And so it's important to make sure that you also allow time for those relationships that fill you back up.
As I hear you talk about that, I'm thinking of Jesus' life on earth, as we read about in the Gospels. And we see him choosing who he spent time with. He loved everybody, he accepted everybody, but he didn't spend time equally with everybody. He intentionally sought out times when he was with people who could, for using my words, fill him up in some way.
Yes. I always say he had the 3, the 12, and the multitudes. Mm-hmm. And the 3 were his people he did the emotional rest with, because those are the ones that got to be there at the Mount of Transfiguration and to have the authentic revealing of who he was before anyone else. And then you have the 12 that he broke bread with, and that were able to have kind of that closer relationship, and that he trusted with that social rest part. And then you have the multitude, who really are the ones that are pulling from him.
Right.
They're the ones who needed things. And it wasn't that they were bad, because we're part of the multitude too. So it wasn't that they were bad. It was just the nature of the relationship.
So we can feel okay in intentionally choosing to spend time with people who nourish us. That sounds like such an important picture. We still have sensory rest and creative rest.
Yeah, sensory rest has to do with being mindful of what your atmosphere looks like. So if you're working in a office space, let's say, that has bright lights, and you're on your computers all day with the computer screen lights, and there's a background noise, maybe it's like a hospital even, where you have that hum of just people and traffic and all this noise, you have to be aware that that affects you as far as your stress level, because all of that sensory input causes you to stay kind of a little on edge until, if you continue with that, it can lead to sensory overload. And so for many people, they don't understand that they have a sensory rest deficit, but they realize when they leave work, they may have sat at a desk all day. So there's no way they are physically tired. I mean, they sat still, but they're feeling drained kind of in their body. And part of that could be due to not having adequate sensory rest if there's a lot of sensory input in their office environment.
And our current world, oh my, such distraction, such sensory overload in so many areas, and to recognize what that does to us. Creative rest. I know in my own life that as I the writing part of who I am, and I'm creating, there's times when there's just nothing there to create, and I just have to move away, and there's just nothing in me to do that can productively create anything, and I have to get some rest there. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Yes, with creative rest, it's not about the production, because sometimes when I say creative rest, people think I mean take one of those painting classes where you get to paint and kind of get your stress out. I don't have an issue with that, but that's not creative rest. That's actually creative work, because you're still putting a demand on your creativity to create something. Mm-hmm. Creative rest is when you actually allow creation to bring rest to you. So that could be either natural or man-made. So one of the articles that I was looking at when I was doing the research for this talked about how many people feel more energized and more happy and more at peace when they're at the beach or at bodies of water. And I speak a lot, so when I go talk to people and I ask them if anybody feels like that, it's amazing the number of hands that go up that say, yes, I just feel better when I'm around bodies of water. That is the easiest example I know of creative rest.
I feel that way.
Just that awe and inspiration you get from seeing something so much greater than you. See, watching the ocean waves go in and go out, looking at the mountains, watching a flower bloom. I mean, it's not something that has to be really big or complex, or that you have to travel to go do. It could be something simple that you're allowing yourself to appreciate the beauty of that creative aspect. And it also includes things like music. So some people who get this from listening to great music or beautiful music. Some get it from looking at beautiful artwork.
These kinds of rest, I can certainly see places where I need to be more intentional in my own life in some of these areas. What would you say to someone who feels like, I don't have time to get this kind of rest? There's just too much to do.
Well, that's the thing. That's where most of the world is that they feel like, well, who has time to do 7 more things
right.
to try to get this type of rest? I always say this: if you don't make time for rest, rest will command its space in your life, because that's when things happen, like accidents that could have been avoided, because you're not concentrating anymore. And you're not able to have a clear mental space. Your reaction time has dropped down because your sensories are overloaded. That's when people start having problems with thoughts of suicide, because now life no longer has enjoyment, because we're not spending time with people who are life-giving. and we're not allowing ourselves to feel like we can be real and authentic. So we feel like, well, people don't even really know who I am. So does it really matter that I'm here? We get into a lot of different areas of our life where we complain about that can only really be resolved when we start looking at restoring those rest deficits.
In the book, Sacred Rest, you also talk about the different gifts of rest, and we don't have time to go through all of those, but just a word or two about how to find those gifts and what kind of gifts we can find in rest.
Well, just probably one of my favorite examples would be the gift of reflection. You know, many times when people tell me they don't have time to rest, what I find is that they also tend to not have time to appreciate kind of the work that they're doing. So they're very good at producing. So they're constantly producing things in their life, whether that's accomplishing goals or meeting achievements. So they're always on the go getting things done. They're usually high achievers. So they know how to do good work, but they never take the time to reflect on the work that they've done so that they can then appreciate what's already have occurred and to celebrate the journey that they're on. And so that is a gift when you rest. You have a time to look back and to see how far you've come, to see what God's done in your life, to see the things that you can celebrate without always feeling like you're having to push on to the next thing.
That is a gift, a wonderful gift. On your website, Dr. Dalton-Smith, you have a rest quiz, and we're going to make sure that the link to that rest quiz is in the show notes. But what is that rest quiz? And invite people to take that. We'll make sure the link is available.
Yes, it's at restquiz.com, very simple. And what it is an opportunity to see which of the 7 types of rest that you are most deficient in. Because the issue is, it's not that you need all 7. You have to have all 7, but you're likely already getting most of them. You just didn't know what you were doing, and you didn't know how it was applying to you. But there's usually 1 or 2 that you are not getting because it's just like you didn't realize that it was something that you could ask for yourself. And once you identify that 1 or 2 that are still a deficiency and start fixing those areas, that's when you really start noticing that restoration that occurs.
Restquiz.com, and we'll make the link available in the show notes as well. Very insightful, and it only takes a few minutes to take that rest quiz. Well, Dr. Dalton-Smith, I so appreciate you being with us and unpacking some about this. We'll make sure that our listeners in the show notes can find links to the ways to get in touch with you, to your book, Sacred Rest. It's really been a pleasure to have you with us today.
Now, thanks so much for having me, Carol.
When you were listening to that discussion of these 7 areas of rest, did you narrow in on, that's the area that I know I am rest deficient in, and I need to take action there? I hope so. Dr. Sandra Dalton-Smith's book, Sacred Rest, outlines these so simply and clearly. A very helpful way to unpack the various areas of rest. And as a start, I want to again encourage you to go to restquiz.com. It just takes just a few minutes. It's free, and you can download a personalized response about what areas of rest you may need to focus on. And also on Dr. Dalton-Smith's website, there's a lot of other resources that I'd encourage you to check out. And we'll make sure the links to all of that are in the show notes for this episode. Thanks again, friends, for joining me on these weekly episodes where we unpack various aspects of the fully alive life that Jesus came for all of us to experience, physically, emotionally, relationally, and spiritually. And I want to invite you again to check out our online community, fullyalivegroup.com, where we have premium content, expert Christian coaching, and a confidential environment unpacking some of these tough topics in more depth, and we'd love to have you there. Thanks again for being part of our podcast family. And until next time, may God bless you.
Thank you for listening to Relationship Prescriptions with Dr. Carol. Our purpose is to provide trustworthy resources that help you and others live fully alive in every way as God intended. If you would like to help others experience transformation in their lives and relationships, we invite you to partner with us. Text the word GIVE, that's GIVE, to the number 512-980-1620. Or visit our website at drcarolministries.com/donate to make a one-time contribution or monthly gift. Your financial support allows us to expand our message and to help others. Thank you so much, and may God bless you.